well, thanks. That I appreciate that.
Okay, over to you, Zoe.
Thank you, Linda. Excuse me. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me again for another installment of the solar seasons of 2020. And we have come already to Cancer season. This beautiful image is again from Kio Leonis. I'm getting a theme developing here. I can't really pull myself away from using his beautiful paintings as my opening image. Okay, I'm going to start today with a poem from William Blake, and he has, according to his A Rodden rated chart on AstroDance, he has Cancer rising and a moon in Cancer, so I thought he fits. As well, he was also born a year after the conjunction between Eris and Pluto in Sagittarius, so that occurred in 1756, and William Blake was born in 1757. And his son's in Sagittarius, but yes, like I said, his moon at least is in Cancer. So yeah, he's an important figure. I think his beautiful teachings really tie into what's unfolding in these times. And I noticed recently, I revisited Cosmos and Psyche recently, Richard Tarnas's book, wonderful book, and he rates a mention in there for that reason as being sort of like the carrier of something significant, like a cultural leader. And still, he's a cultural leader for me. He's a hero of mine. So yeah, without further ado, please forgive the masculine intonation of this poem. I think we can forgive him for the time to which he was born. Nonetheless, I think it's a beautiful poem. And the image is also his. It's known as Hecate, but I think it has another name as well, which escapes me now. But anyway, to mercy, excuse me, to mercy, pity, peace, and love, all pray in their distress, and to these virtues of delight return their thankfulness. For mercy, pity, peace, and love is God our Father dear, and mercy, pity, peace, and love is man his child and care. For mercy has a human heart, pity a human face, and love the human form divine, and peace the human dress. Then every man of every clime that prays in his distress, prays to the human form divine, love, mercy, pity, peace. And all must love the human form in heathen, Turk, or Jew, where mercy, love, and pity dwell, there God is dwelling too. Okay, so I can't start this presentation without honouring the murder of George Floyd and, of course, all the many millions of oppressed Black people, people of colour over history. And that's been the macrocosmic theme du jour for the last, throughout Gemini season, and that's where we're at still. We're still in Gemini season in the last few days. So George Floyd's murder has shone a spotlight onto the important issues around racism and systemic oppression, and the Black Lives Matter rallies that have taken off all over the world. There's been so much conversation. I don't ever recall it being this way, and in terms of the way that it's being talked about everywhere I go, even in a relatively small town in Western Australia. It's obviously got roots as well, that the oppression of Black people and Indigenous people in Australia as well, with our Aboriginal people suffering immeasurably since colonialization here. Yeah, so I just wanted to honour that and point to that as being so pertinent to what we've seen. So I've asked the question here, why now? Why does it seem like this change that is emerging and it might actually stick? So I think it comes down to, probably among many other things, but I've put it down to the Eris square to Pluto, the Capricorn incorporated moving into Aquarius, Mars, Ceres and Neptune in Pisces, and Neptune square to the lunar nodes, and the Venus retrograde in Gemini square to Neptune as well. Jupiter conjunction with Pluto and Pallas Athena, the south node ruler being Jupiter, and the north node ruler Mercury being in Cancer. There seems to be a willingness to listen, which I talked a lot about last month. So the microcosmic, I've been thinking, I've seen how we've come off the back of the first eclipse of that new chapter in the nodal story with the full moon Sagittarius eclipse, and I've been observing how ideologies, people can get very idealistic, of course, and ideologies can act as somewhat of a security blanket, especially during times like these of such uncertainty. It seems people really cling to the ideologies to which they believe in or are attached to for whatever reason. But as well, conversely, this quote from Marie-Louise von Franz, I'm just going to move my, it says, all teachings and traditions have some value in preventing one from complete disorientation when one touches the unconscious, which is what's happening. I really feel like we're tapping into something so big right now, and a lot of it is so unconscious. And so in order to maintain our bearings, we have to have something to keep us afloat, and to hold on to find firm footing. That's a slippery slope, so it can become quite problematic when we become overly invested in like it becomes an ideology rather than just a guiding kind of idea. Okay, so, and of course we've been living through the Venus inferior conjunction, which occurred on the 3rd or 4th of June, and the Mars conjunct Neptune square to the Sun, which was on the 12th of June exact. It's separating now, but still ongoing. Pluto retrograde square to Eris, which was exact just a couple of days ago, the 14th and 15th of June. And Mercury's retrograde. I honour Mercury's place here today. Hopefully it'll all go relatively smoothly. Mercury's stationing retrograde later today. So that's a shift, a significant one for us all. The waning crescent moon in Gemini occurs tomorrow, will conjoin Venus as the morning star, and I finally got to spot Venus this morning. It's been so cloudy here, but today she peaked out and it was high. She was higher than I expected actually, and it was exciting. So, and the Sun will be separating from the conjunction with the lunar north node, so applying now, and will conjoin the lunar north node in Gemini 29 degrees just before the ingress of the Cancer solstice, the ingress of the Sun into Cancer, which occurs on the 21st of June, just before dawn here in Western Australia. And I apologise again, my times are all shown in Australian Western Standard Time, which is Greenwich Mean Time +8. Sorry, I usually put that in there on my slide. I forgot this time. Okay, so I came across a little video from Alan Watts, and this just resonated so much for me. This quote I've taken from it. Alan Watts has Capricorn, Sun, Mercury and Mars, and Pluto in Cancer. I'm sure most are familiar with the story of the astronaut who, when asked if he had been to heaven and seen God, well, what of God? To which he replied, she's black. Imagine that the divine is not a luminous being blazing with light, but in an unfathomable darkness. I love that. This is the chart for the Cancer solstice, and I'm not going to talk too much about this or the new moon 12-ish hours later, because so much is being said already, and I have a lot more to get through. But I wanted to point to the relevance for me of the moon, of course being the ruler of Cancer, at 25 Gemini, exactly square to Mars at 25 of Pisces, and how that's going to be a significant aspect that we need to work on integrating throughout Cancer season and throughout our winter, summer respective seasons until we come to the Libra equinox in 3 months' time. This beautiful image is Georgia O'Keeffe's Wave, or Wave Night. And for me, Cancer is the crab that dwells along the shores that bridge consciousness and unconsciousness. And among the flotsam and jetsam and the erosion that occurs on those edges as the unconscious beats down on the sands of time, you know, it's quite dramatic, but it's quite right. I really have that kind of experience on an inner level, and I feel like that's how I'm not 100% comfortable with the term growth, because it's not always growth. It's it's change, and it is evolution, but it's not always, it's not like a unidirectional, like we're not elevators, you know, we don't just go up and down. It's like multivalent. So and this is where our evolution occurs, along our most uncomfortable emotional edges. So Cancer the crab, all about subjective experience. Cancer says, I feel. Often underestimated and sentimentalized, although I might be biased because I have a Cancer sun and Mercury. But I feel like Cancers are often painted as being very kind of limited in their view of how people talk about Cancer to a significant degree. But essentially it is about that being informed by our emotional state, and I've put that emotion there to remind me to just mention that emotion is in motion. It's a fluid state like water. The stagnancy of water creates toxicity, so allowing ourselves to get stuck in that kind of swampy, although swamps can be very healthy, but and there's certainly times for swamplands, you know, in life, and this is one of them, I'd suggest. So maintaining the connection between the inner and outer life. Jason Holly speaks about this beautifully in one of his talks, the connection between Cancer and Capricorn, or the 4th and 10th house, the irrigation canals of Mesopotamia, all of that sort of thing, allowing the flow of the water to go both ways, lest we dry out too much. Excuse me, I don't know why my phone's ringing, because I've always got it on silent. Sorry about that. No, it never calls. Usually. Okay, so drums now. Okay, being centered where we are, being actually living our lives where they actually exist, allows for the numinous or the divine or spirit or God or whatever term we're comfortable with to approach us when we are grounded in our inner life. There is, of course, with Cancer, the defenses and the crabby claws and the shell. We defend against pain, and we are armed against insecurity. And it's a very emotional realm, that kind of when we become triggered in that sense. And just to also note the north nodes of Pluto, Saturn and Jupiter, all in Cancer. Here is a Cancer who has done her work. She Pima Kodron. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but she has Mercury, Mars, Sun, Venus, and Pluto all in Cancer. When we protect ourselves so we won't feel pain, that protection becomes armor, like armor that imprisons the softness of the heart, which is such the story for many Cancerians and many people with strong Cancer or fourth house signatures. We lose access to our vulnerability and our open-heartedness and our accessibility by defending against pain and the threat of like what we perceive, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, of insecurity. So the Cancer solstice new moon eclipse is very exciting, and a lot's being said about it, including by Gemini Brett, who did an amazing Norwalk talk about it, and I think he's done a talk for EA Zoom as well. That's available for free. He's naming this North Node eclipse as the most powerful, excuse me, that's going to stop in a sec, the most powerful celestial and therefore terrestrial event of our lifetimes. So again, I'm not going to talk to this too much because so much is being said about it, except to note that the cycle is beginning with this approach to Hygeia, Vesta and Mercury, the beginning of the Cancer solar season. And yeah, the cardinal points are pretty loaded to say the least. So it's going to be an interesting season. And the quincunx as well to Saturn at 0 degrees of I've put Capricorn there. I should have put Aquarius, excuse that typo. Yes. And we'll be able to view the waxing crescent moon conjunct Mercury on the 22nd of June if the trickster is playing the game. Well, actually, Mercury won't be visible by then because it's too hard to see. But yes, the crescent moon will be there, and there'll be the conjunction with Mercury occurring. Mercury, who will be retrograde by then. So the sun in aspect throughout this season begins, apart from the solar eclipse, begins with the quincunx to Saturn retrograde, exact on the 21st of June, the solstice, just following the new moon. And then finishes as well with the opposition to Saturn retrograde on the 21st of July. So in between all of that, we've got all of these bits and pieces. So the conjunction with Hygeia, that cycle began at 2 Taurus with Uranus in April. The square to Chiron, which takes us back retrospectively to Aries season, and the new moon conjunct Chiron, which was really potent. And, you know, what an incredible season we've had since that equinox. The world is irrecognizable to what it was. So here we are at the turn of the wheel, and we'll see what comes by the Libra equinox. The sextile to Uranus in Taurus on the 1st of July, the conjunction was at 6 Taurus on the 26th of April, so just in Taurus season, of course. The inferior conjunction with Mercury is on the 2nd of July. The exterior conjunction was in Taurus, I think at the beginning of May. Then the trine to Eris on the 4th of July, which harkens back like the quincunx to Saturn, or aspects to Saturn and the Sun, between Saturn and the Sun, I should say, and Ceres and Pluto all take us back to mid-January, of course, when we had the conjunction at the beginning of this new cycle in which we are birthing as we speak. So Ceres was a significant player in that conjunction in the same degree, and Gray Crawford did an amazing article about that that's well worth a read. And so the conjunction with Vesta on the 5th of July, which is also the full moon, and a new cycle with Vesta is being born. The previous cycle, I think I've got a slide noting that later, but I'm pretty sure it was in Pisces. And it commenced last year. So we've done if you've got a prominent Vesta, it's worth giving consideration to all of these cycles with the asteroid goddesses. The square to true black moon Lilith on the 11th of July. That conjunction with the true black moon Lilith was on the 26th of March, again Aries season of course, and the trine to Neptune in Pisces is on the 13th of July. That conjunction was on International Women's Day, 8th of March. That cycle began. The opposition to Pallas Athena is also on the 13th of July and coincides, those two, with the waning square, the third quarter moon in Aries. The conjunction between the Sun and Pallas Athena was at 10 Sag in December last year. The opposition as well to Jupiter is on the 15th of July, and the conjunction was at 5 Capricorn, and it was around that new moon eclipse, just around Christmas. If we can think back to there, which unbeknownst to us all, that was sort of the beginning of the coronavirus of COVID. And the opposition to Pluto as well, which the cycle again began mid-January. Of course, that's all pointing to the midpoint of their retrograde cycles, that opposition. The Sun square Eris in Aries is on the 17th of July, and the conjunction was, that cycle began on the 13th of April. And yeah, as I was saying, the opposition to Saturn, which again marks the midpoint of the retrograde, is on the 21st of July at the new moon. Okay, so we're seeing more retrogrades joining. Well, I've put there Mercury because I didn't know when I'd be doing this talk, but Mercury stationing retrograde today. Venus still retrograde, Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto and Pallas Athena all retrograde, being joined first of all by Neptune on the 23rd of June until November, Ceres on the 8th of July until October, Chiron on the 13th of July until December, and Eris on the 22nd of July until 2021. And you can see there a few things to note about those retrograde periods, but I'll talk to each of those, assuming I get to continue with these talks. I will address them more thoroughly in later months, but Neptune will be returning to the second decan of Pisces for the last hurrah for this cycle, for its time in Pisces, because the second decan is Jupiter ruled. So it's a very different flavoured part of the Neptune through Pisces cycle in the last few years of it. And we've had a little taste of that in the last few months since Neptune hit that 20-degree Pisces mark. Ceres, and again, Jason Holly's explication of the Ceres archetype is, for me, the most resonant, profound sort of discussion of Ceres that I've come across. Not to detract from anyone else's, but it's just that he gets so deep with it, and I feel like she's a very deep and important planetary archetype for our times, increasingly so, as with all the feminine energies. So Chiron stations retrograde as Mercury goes direct at 5 degrees of Cancer on the 12th, 13th of July. So that's an interesting thing to note. Eris will be square to Pluto throughout. As you can see, Eris it doesn't even leave 23 degrees. She just, in her retrograde, is very slow and her movement is slow in general. So that square to Pluto is maintained throughout her retrograde. And as well, Mars in his retrograde will cross Eris 3 times. So we'll get to that later in the year as well. Venus in Gemini. Venus stations direct on the 24th of June at 5 degrees of Gemini, and then immediately applies to trine Juno, and immediately starts to separate from the trine to Saturn. As I was mentioning, she is now in morning star phase, Lucifer the light bringer, and she remains as a morning star until February 2021. The minor asteroid Medusa applies to conjoin Venus around the full moon in Capricorn, Medusa being, in a mythological kind of way, the mother of creativity, being the mother of Pegasus at her death, which is an interesting thing to think about. I thought that was a pretty important, beautiful point to include. And Venus will sextile Chiron on the 10th of July, and then come to maximum. Got to try and stop talking too much to each point because I'm going to take too long otherwise. So yeah, the maximum brightness of on the 12th of July, and the shamanic astrology approach for the crown chakra gate occurs on the 17th of July, and that is resonates with Inanna's descent to the underworld, and that's a very beautiful practice to engage with. So the first of those chakra gates occurs on the 17th of July. And then the waning crescent moon again will conjoin Venus tomorrow, and then again on the 17th of July. And that's always a beautiful thing to witness, and is actually the marker for that crown chakra gate, or for all the chakra gates, I should say. I loved this image and had to include it. It's called Muse at Sunrise by Alphonse Osbert. And this for me was the perfect quote to encapsulate the Venus star point, like the distillation of my Venus retrograde. It's sort of just captured it so much, so I thought I would share it. It's from Carl Kerenyi's essay Core. In what direction must we enlarge our thought in order to stand in fit relationship to the phenomenon? Which really applies to what we're seeing in the collective. And then I came across this quote from Ijeoma Oluwo, who's an American writer. I think she wrote So You Want to Talk About Race, and this is a quote from her: "When we identify where our privilege intersects with somebody else's oppression, we'll find our opportunities to make real change." Which really ties in for me to the Mercury retrograde that we'll be seeing. So just as a side note, I cast her chart, she's got Sun, Mercury and Mars in Capricorn, opposite Ceres in Cancer, square to Eris and Pallas Athena in Aries, and a Libra stellium, the Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto in Libra, and possibly a moon as well, though I don't have a birth time, of course. But it really, the conversations that have been being had all over the world about white fragility, which I know is a bit contentious, but I just wanted to use it as an example of what we've been witnessing and living through this last few weeks, 6 weeks, and the implication, accusation that I am a racist evokes defenses and an emotional kind of reaction in most white people, I should say, and but those unsettling emotions are always the portal to another dimension of who we are on a soul level. So that unsettling experience and the resistance that we feel to an introduced idea, as we experience with the Pluto and Gemini dynamic, there is the unsettling that occurs when a new idea is brought to us, and that's our indicator that we need to have a closer look. So and it brings through that, if we take the opportunity to enter through that rupture into a different perspective of who we are that somebody else might bring to us, it enhances and complexifies the awareness of who we are. And I've written there complex, contrary and confounding, because it's completely disorientating sometimes to be faced with parts of ourselves that have been unconscious and we are ignorant to, despite perhaps having the best intentions and meaning well. Sometimes that's the road to hell is paved with good intentions kind of thing. So the loss of innocence and not being a victim anymore, and then we come to our vulnerable state and we can consider another's point of view, having dropped our defenses, and we come to a place of empathy and compassion, and we can relate. And therefore, to me, that's the hero's journey. That's being heroic enough to experience our feelings and to follow where they lead without getting stuck. Sometimes we have to get stuck for a while and process and whatnot, but there's also the need to keep, it's a fluid and emotion, movement, dynamic process. And we bring those gifts back on our return. And so the Mercury retrograde, Mercury has been in Cancer since May and remains in Cancer throughout Cancer season until the 5th of August in Leo season. And the station retrograde occurs, like I said, tomorrow, stationing today, tomorrow. So, and that actually occurs conjunct the minor asteroid Metis, who was the mother of Pallas Athena, and swallowed by Zeus, as he was so wont to do. And then Pallas Athena was born motherless, we are told, from the head of Zeus, Jupiter. So I think Metis is a beautiful archetype, and she is about that. She's the goddess of wisdom, of course, and so Pallas Athena has inherited that wisdom, that cunning, that ability to see beyond what's apparent, and sort of the end game kind of long view sort of perspective. Yes, she is very wise. So I feel like that's an important part to take away now from what we're about to embark on, this psychopomp Mercury journey through the underworld, and to be companioned by Metis in a way, although we will have other companions along the way as well. Including Vesta, Ceres, and Hygeia are very important to this, I feel, being that the Venus retrograde was so tied as well to Vesta and Hygeia, and now we've got the repeat of that with the planet Mercury, who sort of brings consciousness to what we've already experienced with Venus. At a more bodily kind of level, at a more relational level, we now get to travel this through our own emotional underworld in some sense and sort of make sense of it, is what it's brought to me. So the inferior conjunction, the Cazimi, occurs on the 1st of July, and then the conjunction with Hygeia on the 5th of July, then a square with Mars on the 8th of July is exact, and the station direct, which occurs on the 12th of July, is a square to the Moon, Mars, and Chiron, all in Aries, and Chiron is stationing retrograde at the same time, as I said. So there's that potential for conflict, especially resulting from the unmet expectations, from our woundedness, from our, there's a lot of stuff going on with this Mercury retrograde, and a lot goes on during the period of the Mercury retrograde, so I best keep talking. So okay, so the Cazimi occurs in a T-square with Chiron and Juno, which made me think about the wound in me that impacts the we, and how we can use Mercury to navigate that through communication and the dropping of defenses. Kind of trying to keep in mind that the wisdom of Metis and the something's playing out here is the way that I always look at astrology, on this personal kind of level, how things are just constantly unfolding and it's constantly spiraling up and down at the same time, and things are just perfect. So the waxing sextile as well to Uranus brings that kind of download potential for that like instant insight, and it is the alchemical albedo moment, you know, we get an insight at that Cazimi point potentially, and the days around it, and the days following the Cazimi, the Sun and Vesta go on to trine Ceres as well, which brings in that the loss of innocence, the grief kind of component. We'll see how things continue to unfold in the collective and in our personal lives in that sense. But I also want to note the connection between Chiron and Ceres, Ceres being the goddess of the grain and relating to Virgo in that regard, and Chiron being said to be a potential ruler as well of Virgo. I feel like they work really well together, Chiron and Virgo, but and that crisis, that inherent 150-degree aspect of crisis and coming to that decision moment, and can we defer to wisdom kind of to higher wisdom somehow, like having that Metis aspect. But as well, we need to forgive ourselves for our own trespasses, because we are human, frail, you know, that's our inherent lot in life, all of us. And, you know, guilt comes out of that. Guilt brings awareness, guilt brings maturity, when we are able to carry it like the grown-ups that we purport to be. And then Mercury trines Ceres for the 3rd time on the 24th of July, and that synod commenced on the 12th of January, back in that mid-January Saturn Pluto conjunction, all of that last eclipse season. So yes, the Mercury retrograde involves Vesta, Hygeia and Ceres, and I've got a few quotes here which I felt were important to include. By the time Mercury stations direct in the dawn sky, he will have been in contact with the 3 bodies, Vesta, Hygeia and Ceres, twice, with a 3rd contact direct to follow. So Vesta teaches the wisdom that periodic retreat from others in order to cleanse and regenerate the self can lead to a clarity of vision and purpose. Her energy of self-containment pulls us inward, experienced on a psychological level as the compression of our emotions, hitting bottom through separation, loss, grief, despair, failure, frustration and rejection, which we've all had that experience to some extent in the last few months of coronavirus and the social distancing and isolation and quarantining and all those things. And to some extent, we're still in that phase in different parts of the world. So it's ongoing, and Mercury helps us to distill some meaning out of that. Descending, this is another quote from, sorry, that quote was from Demetri George's Asteroid Goddesses wonderful book, and Nancy calls Corbett's book The Sacred Prostitute, which is an amazing read as well. And for me really speaks to Vesta being, and her Vestal virgins, who were essentially sacred prostitutes. Because virgin was never originally the meaning that it had today, as in having not yet had lost our virginity and being sexually active, but actually being whole unto ourselves as women and belonging to no man. Descending into the realm of the unconscious, down into the unknown, away from the tried and true roots, is the first step in redeeming the potential treasures of one's personality, which is very, very Cancerian as well, I believe. And yeah, to again mention Jason Holly's Ceres Dilemma, he calls it, coming to terms with the loss of innocence, which is so important given what we're dealing with in the collective and the Black Lives Matter campaigns all over the world. We do need to come to terms with the loss of innocence, in terms of that we've all been complicit in this system, despite our best intentions perhaps. So Hygeia is the goddess of holistic health and the prevention of sickness and the maintenance of wellness. And you know, again, she's been a player all throughout this Venus retrograde and all of this astrological year since. She's always a player, but she's been important throughout this COVID time. So that's what I mean to point to, and I think that that's an important thing to mention. When the crone moon visits on the 19th of July, there is an opportunity to eavesdrop on an important conversation ahead of Leo season, and Venus will be nearby too. So the dark moon in a month's time will conjoin Vesta and Hygeia, and yes, nearby Venus as well. So we might have some kind of insight around that time. Okay, on to Mars. I'll just have a drink, sorry. There's so much to say, it's very wordy. Okay, so Mars still being in Pisces, of course, and separating from the conjunction with Neptune, will sextile Pallas Athena on the 22nd of June, go on to square the lunar nodes on the 26th of June, which is potent, and then will ingress Aries on the 28th of June and remain there for 6 months until January 2021. And immediately at that ingress, there is a kite pattern created, an opposition to the moon in Libra, sextiles to Saturn retrograde at a zero Aquarius, that's right, and the Venus in Gemini having station direct by that point. So yes, 28th and 25th, that's right. So and then the Mercury stationing direct is square, as I said, to Mars and Chiron on the 12th of July, and Mars will go on to conjoin Aries on the 14th, pardon me, Chiron in Aries on the 14th of July. So as I spoke about last month, I think I still feel I'm getting that feeling that maintaining or cultivating in an ongoing kind of way the courage to understand and stay with our genuine conflict, rather than getting lost in blame and neurosis, is very important. It's very easy to just default to like our Cancerian tendencies, which we all have to some extent, and get defensive and put up walls and all of that. But tapping into that Aries Martian courage to be real and be who we are, letting go of kind of who we've been to some extent, you know, just being in the moment, being here now, as Ram Dass would say, the Aries man. So next we've got the Jupiter-Pluto Pallas Athena conjunction. So that occurs on the 30th of June. The exact conjunction between Jupiter and Pluto, 24 degrees and 6 minutes of Capricorn, with Pallas being just a few degrees away, half a degree, sorry, a few minutes away, half a degree away, at 24:39 minutes Capricorn. And the waning square between between Eris and these three is a very important point about this. And I've been doing a lot of work around this cycle and may do a presentation or some writing about it to share at some point. But this story, it's ages old in the sense of the mythology that binds these characters. But this cycle, as I have said before, began in 1756 in Sagittarius. That is the Pluto-Eris cycle, which also involved Pallas Athena back then in 1756. So, and yeah, being in Sagittarius, and now that we've got the South Node in Sagittarius as well, it seems it's just we can see in the world how this is all unfolding in the sense of ideologies and lived experiences, and how do we bring these all together so we can be a part of the solution, to put it plainly, by doing what we can do to set things right in our own lives, in the simple sense of aligning with our own truth and honouring our own experience, remembering though that, like, to maintain that contact with our heart and to drop those defences, doing our Cancer work, you know, retreating inward, downward, and allowing for the process to sort of do its work on us. So then, you know, once we have on an inner level aligned with our truth, we then walk our talk for the world to witness. And as well, that such a big part of this whole thing for me on both the personal and collective level is the reclamation of the lost parts in our shadow, of which Eris is a beautiful representation. She's still so completely, you know, spoken of a bit disdainfully and fearfully and that sort of thing. I mean, I understand, of course, discord is uncomfortable, but she's actually on our side. Well, I don't know if she's on our side. She's not on our side in the sense of our ego, but she certainly knows better than that ego sensibilities. And then the final pass of this will occur on the 13th of November and is even closer. They'll all be in exactly the same degree minute. It's pretty profound. There's a lot to talk. I could talk all day about that, but I'm not going to. Okay, so Saturn's retrograde, returning into Capricorn on the 2nd of July. I came across this quote from Austin Coppock, who wrote a beautiful piece about it a couple of years ago when Saturn ingressed Capricorn. So it was 2017, of course, when that happened. And I thought this quote was very pertinent to now. To extend your vision into both the future and the past, to obtain the goat's wide horizontal gaze, you must be able... I apologise for that. I don't actually know what's happening with my speaker. You must be able to accept what you see. This is a challenge, for there are always events hiding in both the future and the past that will exceed your current emotional capacity. The blessings of hindsight and foresight, the Titans Epimetheus and Prometheus, are not without price. So I think that's really pertinent to now, include like linking in the various other things going on as well, in particular, Cancer season, and in particular the Mercury retrograde. We can really reflect quite successfully during Mercury retrogrades and have come out the other side with meaningful insights and retrograde season in general, as a matter of, there's so much retrograde energy right now, so it behooves us to reflect, to go in. And stationing Saturn is stationing direct on the 28th of September, square to Mars in Aries, and Mars is conjunct Eris and Black Moon Lilith at that time, so that is a big part of the second half of the year, this interaction between Saturn and Mars. It'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. And Saturn will return to Aquarius again on the 17th of December, closely followed by the Great Conjunction, which is on the solstice. And the themes during the retrograde of Saturn into Capricorn, we can revisit these themes from 2017 to 2020 that we've sort of, in our personal lives, what's actually happened in that time in relation to our own Saturn. And then Saturn will not be back in Capricorn until 2047. So we'll have many stories unfolding between now and then. I wanted to include this beautiful painting from Rembrandt, who is also a Sun in Cancer. It's called The Rape of Proserpina, and I just wanted to make room in this talk for that, our requisite descent to the underworld, and what this time, I think it's undeniable that we need to allow the gravitas and the gravity of what the times we're living through to have its way with us and pull us down and go into those difficult emotions. That's how we learn and grow and ultimately evolve. So, and now we come to the Capricorn Full Moon Eclipse on the 5th of July, which is an amazing full moon, though, it's a penumbral eclipse again, like the Sagittarian one, not like the potent solar annular one that we'll be having in a few days' time, but we'll see how things unfold in between the two. Certainly that the new moon that we're about to meet heralds a very interesting time, and I think that Rembrandt sort of says it best with his image, perhaps. So yeah, when we come to the illumination, the sun in Cancer shining upon and illuminating the moon in Capricorn, we'll have a new outlook on all of what's going on in just a couple of weeks' time. It's amazing, and I love the way that astrology provides these cycles with which we work, and we it's just so dynamic and beautiful. But so the sun at this full moon will be conjunct Vesta, applying to conjoin Vesta. So it's in the very, very, very balsamic phase of their cycle. So as I said, yeah, that cycle commenced last year in March in Pisces. There is also the harmonious aspect between the sun and moon and Ceres in Pisces, and Saturn retrograde, Saturn as the ruler of the moon is still retrograde and in Capricorn by this time. And as well, of course, Pluto, Jupiter and Pallas Athene are all at 23 degrees of Capricorn, which is a very important part of this lunation, obviously. Although it's not like a close conjunction, but certainly remarkable. And it all harkens back to the new moon, the South Node eclipse conjunct Jupiter in December around Christmas, and also the Saturn-Pluto series conjunction in Capricorn in mid-January. And we can look at the way the world has unfolded this year, looking at it under the light of this full moon will be meaningful. I think there's a few things I want to talk about that when I'm meditating on this moon, these are the things that sort of came through, the threads that I pulled upon. So of course, again, just to mention that maintenance of connection between the inner and the outer, the Cancer Capricorn worlds. And I just wanted to note the idea of the yin leadership, which Lawrence Hillman talks about. And he, I believe, works within corporate America. You know, this unfolding feminine approach to leadership, which we are more and more seeing and being, hopefully, is the point that I want to leave everyone with. And I found this quote from a Jungian woman who gave this talk to, it's available through Jungian Anthology podcast. It's worth listening to. It's a talk about Martin Luther King, but this quote: learning to attend to our emotions for the sake of activating a new level of political energy and a new political identity. These emergent capacities first appear through cultural leaders who lead people to higher levels of evolution. This is known as affect freedom, which Dunlap, who wrote a book about this whole concept, defines as the capacity to experience and use the full range of emotion for the psychological, political, and moral needs of one's time. I think that's relevant for each of us to some degree. And she also quotes this man Aftab Omar, who's a sociologist and psychologist, and interestingly founded the Meridian University, which I thought was apt given the subject matter for today being Cancer Capricorn. Cultural leaders are able to transmute how they are personally affected by the culture into creative action that midwives the future, which is so beautifully Cancer Capricorn. And Martin Luther King is, of course, an incredible illustration, embodiment of these energies. So he had a Capricorn sun opposite Pluto retrograde in Cancer, trine to Venus, Moon and Ceres in Pisces. As well, just to mention another potentially contentious figure, but a very interesting one, and I'm only new to the work of Camille Paglia, but I'm finding a lot of things of great value actually in her work, although I know that's possibly pushes buttons for a lot of people, it seems. But I'm a bit ignorant and a bit like coming from a different, I'm not educated in that sense, so it's been really interesting to understand some of her work. And she's actually an Aries sun, but she has her midheaven, her meridian is Cancer Capricorn, or her midheaven is at almost 22 degrees of Cancer. She's got an A-Rodden rated chart, and she actually, I believe, is an astrologer, so it's interesting. So this full moon is, of course, conjunct to Vesta at 13 degrees. I mucked that up there. So the sun is actually conjunct to Vesta, but the full moon is in opposition, so it's potent. Illuminating the need for more honest discourse around feminine sexuality, similar to the conversations being had about race now. So dropping some defenses around feminism as an ideology, perhaps, and what it is to be a woman, and how sexuality is a part of that, you know, and it actually, I'll just let Camille say it, woman's sexual power to fascinate and destroy can paralyze, incapacitate, and yes, kill. There are many examples of this throughout history. And it's kind of naive and kind of obtuse, is that the right word, to persist with the thought that it's otherwise. From where I'm standing at the moment anyway, I'm doing a lot of work with Vesta, so that's sort of, I think that's important for us all. And hopefully, as I don't want to turn the conversation away from Black Lives Matter at all, but I just hope that there's more, as it continues to unfold, we'll have more conversations about femininity and masculinity, and less of the gender divide and more of the, let's have a conversation without like wanting to kill each other would be good. Hey. There's a few, I'll skip over this slide a little bit. There's a few things I was going to do, all the moon's aspects, interplanetary aspects for the month, which that was very ambitious and ridiculous probably. But so there are some interesting points. This is not just about the moon, but this slide, but there are points that the moon, you know, obviously moving fast throughout the zodiac, travels the entire zodiac over the month. And so, yeah, take a photo of this slide if you want to, but basically, yeah, it is an interesting time, even though there's not as much to talk about in that post full moon. It's still an interesting time to be attuned to, and one of the best ways I find to do that is through tuning into the moon's movements. And of course, as the moon passes through all the cardinal signs, it's very interesting at the moment. And then now that we have the lunar nodes into the mutable signs and the passage of the moon through Venus and Pisces and Virgo at the lunar bendings, the lunar node bendings, and all of that, it's very rich, those minutiae of our days. Okay, and so the sun opposing the retrograde planets in Capricorn between 21 and 28 degrees, so later in the month, is of course the midpoint of the retrograde, and Erin Sullivan in her book Retrograde Planets defines it as the opposition as the turning point of the cycle, marking the end of the wildly resistant phase and the beginning of gradual incorporation of new ways of experiencing central power. And I haven't actually put anything there for Pallas Athene. I'm just going to address the Jupiter, Pluto and Saturn oppositions more, because we understand as a group more about what those mean. But in terms of it being, I think always, you know, the integration is always the thing, isn't it? And bringing the Pallas Athena part of who we are into an increasingly conscious place in ourselves and in the stories of our lives and in the collective is pertinent this month. So on the 15th of July, the Jupiter-Sun opposition, if a situation arises out of a Jupiter retrogression, which counters either social law or inner integrity, it is the ideal time to pull back and reflect on what is true for oneself, which we have undoubtedly seen in the last month or so. Indeed, we have seen, you know, the countering of the social law and the integrity of the systems of which we have been implicit complicit for too long. So bringing that back to our real lives, and what is that? How can we relate to that in our personal lives, in our inner lives? The opposition between the Sun and Pluto, of course, and Erin Sullivan says that a great deal of the inner pain we experience under the repeated onslaught of Pluto has to do with unrealized potential, hidden resources with no avenue for expression, or deeply submerged desires which have remained unmet. And I'm just going to skip to the next slide because I wanted to as well honour Jeffrey Wolf Green's contribution to this opposition. I thought this was important. So at this evolutionary bridge, being the opposition, the individual meaning given to the original evolutionary intent must now become social. I'm sorry, I've mucked up that quote terribly. I did it late last night. It must be related to and shared with others. I do apologise for that, but it is about bringing it into the social world in terms of what is happening, what we've been witnessing in the collective, how we can relate to that in our personal lives, and then how we can take that into our social relationships. And just to go back to the Saturn Sun opposition on the 21st of July, one gains perspective on how outdated one's basic assumptions are, which I think we'll see that under as the moon begins to wane again away from the full moon in Capricorn in July, and as this Cancer season unfolds, I think we'll begin to really integrate that, how our basic assumptions are really outdated. So all of those quotes on this slide come from Erin Sullivan's retrograde planets. And then finally, the Cancer new moon, not quite finally, but we're nearly there, is at 28 degrees of Cancer on the 21st of July, and is in the opposition to Saturn. So it's an important point, the second Cancer new moon of this season, of course, which changes the dynamic between new and full moons. So next month in Leo season, we'll have the full moon before we have the new moon. So we'll have the Aquarius full moon before we have the Leo new moon. So that's a significant shift in the way that we relate to our moon and to the moon's function in our lives and in the collective. So yes, the Capricorn, that's an important thing to be aware of, I think, as well, is that the opposition to Saturn, between the new moon's opposition to Saturn with this second Cancer new moon, contrasts as well with that Aquarius full moon in August, because that is square to Uranus. So there's that real old new kind of juxtaposition that we'll get to witness and experience over the end of July and into August, as well as the changing of the swapping of the new full moon dynamic too. So and Eris is stationing retrograde as well at that new moon, so that's important. But going into Leo season, I love this beautiful painting, and I'm sorry that the quality is poor, but I had to include it. It's from Frida Kahlo, who's one of my favourite Cancerians, and she says, "I am my own muse, the subject I know best." And I think that's a good recommendation for us all, to know thyself, and that occurs through having these emotional experiences and an inner life that remains in contact with the outer life that we show, that the two are intertwined and true to one another. And it's such a maternal image, this, and I love the the dark mother, and I love the spheres on each side, and one looks like the moon and one looks like Venus or maybe Mars, or like it. I love this beautiful image. So that's all from me. Thank you so much for being here, and feel free to I'll take questions if anybody has any, and yeah, thank you.
Okay, Zoe, there doesn't appear to be any questions.
Sure.
Thank you for a very thorough presentation. Would everyone now please unmute and thank Zoe Shuttleworth.
Thanks, Zoe.
Thanks, Zoe.
Thank you guys. Thanks so much for being here.
Very interesting. Thanks.